You know, usually when we talk about a historical event or like a massive national shift, there's this expectation of precision.
Right, like we want everything to be very neat and tidy.
Exactly. Like engineering, I always think of it like an X-ray. You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points and says, there it is, that's the break. Broken or not broken, it's clean, it's easy to wrap your head around.
We really do crave that visibility. I mean, we want our history neatly categorized with a clear beginning, middle, and end.
But then you step into the world of rapid societal transformation, specifically the kind of total sweeping national overhaul we were looking at in our deep dive today, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just completely useless.
Oh, totally useless.
We're looking at a historical landscape that defies simple categorization. It is murky, it is chaotic, and yet out of that historical mud emerged something entirely unprecedented. So today, our mission is to explore one of the most astonishingly rapid and comprehensive national transformations in all of human history. We are diving into the source material on the Meiji era of Japan, which spanned from 1868 to 1912.
A mere 44 years.
44 years. I mean, put yourself in the shoes of someone living through that for a second. In a single generation, Japan went from being a highly isolated, deeply feudal society.
A world of samurai and shoguns.
Right, samurai, shoguns, strict class castes, all facing the terrifying threat of Western colonization. And they go from that to becoming a highly industrialized, modern, global superpower.
And, to protect its uniquely Japanese sovereignty, to prevent being swallowed whole by the empires of the West, Japan realized it had to thoroughly westernize.
Which is such a paradox.
It really is. They had to walk an incredibly delicate, incredibly dangerous tightrope. And this balancing act touched literally everything. I mean, they overhauled the military, the government, the economy, right down to the clothes people wore in their own living rooms.
And the literal way they tracked the passing of time, which we will definitely get into because that part blew my mind. But okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how they pulled this off, we have to look at the spark that ignited the powder keg.
The arrival of the Americans.
Exactly. It's 1854. Japan has been largely closed off from the rest of the world for over 2 centuries under a policy called Sakoku. They had restricted trade to just a tiny trickle, mostly with the Dutch and the Chinese at a single port.
And then everything changes.
Right. American Commodore Matthew Perry steams into Edo Harbor with his heavily armed, coal-belching naval ships, the famous black ships.
Just imagine standing on the shoreline as a Japanese citizen or a samurai official. You have never seen a steam-powered vessel in your life.
It must have looked like alien technology.
Basically, yes. You were looking at these massive dark hulls, completely independent of the wind, belching thick black smoke and bristling with modern explosive Pétains guns. I mean, the psychological shock is almost impossible to overstate.
Wow.
It proved undeniably that Japan's wooden coastal defenses and sword-wielding warriors were entirely obsolete. They were completely defenseless against modern Western military power.
And it wasn't just a theoretical threat either. I mean, they only had to look across the water to King China to see their potential future.
It was a very bleak future at that point.
Exactly. Because China was the great cultural older brother of East Asia, the untouchable heavyweight. But China had just been humiliated, defeated, and carved up by Western powers in the First Opium War.
And the Japanese elite were avid readers of international news. They smuggled it in through those Dutch traders you mentioned. So they knew exactly what happened to China.
They knew the British Navy had just absolutely decimated the Chinese forces.
Right. The Japanese leadership realized with terrifying clarity that if they didn't modernize their entire society immediately, they were next. I mean, they would be colonized, their resources extracted, their culture subordinated. It was an existential threat in the pure sense of the word.
So this immense pressure builds up for over a decade. The existing military government, the Tokugawa shogunate, they look incredibly weak because they can't expel these foreigners. Various domains start rebelling. And all of this pressure cooker energy leads to what we call the Meiji Restoration in 1867 and 1868. And the figurehead for this entire revolution, a 14-year-old kid.
Yes, Prince Mutsuhito. He ascends to the chrysanthemum throne as Emperor Meiji.
14 years old. I just can't get over that.
I know, it's wild. He was a teenager, but he was surrounded by brilliant, ambitious, and frankly ruthless young advisors. These were mostly lower-ranking samurai from the outer provinces who hated the shogun.
And they saw an opportunity.
Exactly. They recognized that they needed a unifying symbol to rally the country behind. And the emperor, who had been a politically powerless, purely spiritual figurehead in Kyoto for centuries, was the perfect vessel.
So the pressure on the Tokugawa shogunate becomes so immense that in November of 1867, the ruling shogun, Tokugawa Yoshinobu, looks at the writing on the wall and actually tenders his resignation to this teenage emperor. He formally steps down.
A military dictatorship that had ruled Japan for over 250 years just ends.
Oof, gone. And the capital, Edo, falls the following summer. They rename it Tokyo, which means Eastern Capital, and the young emperor leaves the ancient cloister palaces of Kyoto and moves his residence to the new center of power.
The Tokugawa era is officially dead. The Meiji era, which translates to enlightened rule, is born.
But, you can't just change the letterhead on the government stationery and call it a day. The entire social fabric is unraveling at this point. You need a mission statement. You need to tell millions of people what the new rules are.
And that brings us to the Five Charter Oath of 1868.
Right. Our sources highlight this as a really foundational text of modern Japan.
Oh, absolutely. The Five Charter Oath was a brilliant piece of political communication. It was specifically designed to boost morale, win financial support from wealthy merchants, and placate a deeply, deeply anxious public. It laid out 5 core provisions that served as a total societal reset button.
Okay, let's read through the mechanics of these provisions because they are honestly radical. Provision 1 says, deliberative assembly shall be widely established and all matters decided by public discussion.
Right, so setting the stage for some form of input, though. Public here mostly meant the elite at first.
Makes sense. Then provision 2. All classes, high and low, shall unite in vigorously carrying out the administration of the affairs of state.
Now focus on that phrase, all classes. They are quietly erasing the rigid caste lines that define the feudal era. Because under the Tokugawa, society was strictly divided into 4 tiers. You had samurai, farmer, artisan, and merchant, and you could not move between them.
You were born into it and you died in it, which leads right into provision 3. The common people, no less than the civil and military officials, shall each be allowed to pursue his own calling so that there may be no discontent.
And there it is. This is the death blow to the feudal class system. Suddenly, you are all just citizens of the state with the freedom to choose your profession. A farmer could become a merchant. An artisan could become a bureaucrat.
Just a massive paradigm shift. Then we have provision 4. Evil customs of the past shall be broken off and everything based upon the just laws of nature. Which feels like a very polite way of saying all the old rules are void.
Pretty much.
And finally, provision 5, which might actually be the most crucial for our entire deep dive today. Knowledge shall be sought throughout the world so as to strengthen the foundations of imperial rule.
By explicitly stating that knowledge shall be sought throughout the world, the government was officially giving the nation a mandate to aggressively copy the West. I mean, for 200 years, foreign influence was illegal. It was punished by death.
And now it's mandatory.
Right. Now, the emperor is saying, to be a good, loyal Japanese subject, you must go out and learn everything the foreigners know.
I try to imagine how terrifying yet completely exhilarating this moment must have been for the average person. To put it in modern terms, think of like a massive legacy hardware company, a company that has only ever made physical metal server racks for 50 years.
Okay, I follow you.
And one morning, the new CEO sends out a company-wide memo saying, as of today, we are a cloud software company. We are destroying our hardware factories. Every single employee needs to learn to code by tomorrow, and we are going to beat the tech giants at their own game.
That's actually a great analogy. The level of disruption is comparable, but you have to scale that up to a nation of over 30 million people. And the stakes aren't quarterly profits. The stakes are literal national survival.
But wait, I have to challenge the historical narrative here a bit, because the sources say the young emperor and his advisors wrote this nice aspirational memo saying, we are a modern, unified nation now. But how do you actually enforce that?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, like how do you convince a heavily armed feudal warlord, a daimyo, who has absolute generational control over his own province, his own private samurai army, and his own tax revenue, to just hand over his ancestral land to a teenager in Tokyo? You don't just ask nicely.
No, you certainly don't. And you're pointing out the central logistical nightmare of the Meiji Restoration. Yep. Because if they just marched an army to every province and demanded the land, they would have triggered a multi-decade civil war.
Which would have destroyed them.
Exactly. Would have left them weak and ripe for Western colonization. They had to dismantle the old power structures systematically and ideally without firing a shot. And they started by essentially buying them out.
Okay, wait, explain the mechanics of that. How do you buy out a warlord?
So in 1869, the leaders of the new government, who were actually from powerful domains themselves, persuaded their own daimyos to voluntarily surrender their land registers and census records to the emperor. This was called the abolition of the Han system. The Han were the feudal domains, and they were replaced with modern prefectures.
But why would the daimyos agree to that?
To get them to agree, the central government sweetened the deal immensely. They told the daimyos, "We will confirm you in your hereditary positions, but now you are modern governors of your regions. Furthermore, the central government will take over all your domain's administrative debts, and we will take over the responsibility of paying the stipends of all your samurai."
Okay, so the warlords were basically drowning in administrative debt anyway, having to pay thousands of samurai a yearly stipend just to exist. The new government steps in and says, "We'll take all that debt off your hands, you keep your fancy lifestyle, and you get a modern government title."
Precisely. And to further stroke their egos and maintain social stability at the top, the government created a brand new peerage system in 1884 called the Kazoku.
Ah, the Kazoku.
Yes. They organized the old, ancient court nobles from Kyoto, the former daimyos, and the loyal samurai who helped in the revolution into the 5 Western-style ranks: prince, marquis, count, viscount, and baron.
So they basically dressed up the old feudal lords in European aristocratic titles to keep them happy, while quietly taking away their actual military and financial independence.
That is so clever. But wait, taking on the stipends of hundreds of thousands of samurai. The new central government must have gone massively into debt to afford that.
Oh, they absolutely did. It was staggering. Taking on the samurai stipends consumed nearly a third of the new government's entire revenue.
A third.
Yeah, it was completely financially unsustainable. Eventually, a few years later, the government had to force the samurai to convert their hereditary stipends into one-time government bonds, which drastically reduced the samurai's income and sparked massive inflation. So the buyout prevented an immediate civil war with the lords, but it set a ticking time bomb for the warrior class.
And we will definitely get to that explosion. But dismantling the physical land ownership was really only one pillar of the old world. The sources also highlight an immense religious upheaval that happened simultaneously.
Yes, a massive shift. And this is fascinating to me because we often separate church and state in modern political discussions, But here, religion was a primary tool of statecraft.
It was essential. To elevate the emperor to a preeminent, unquestionable position of authority, the Meiji leadership had to shift the spiritual center of gravity of the entire nation. For 1,000 years, Shinto and Buddhism had been deeply, deeply intertwined in Japan. It was a syncretic belief system where Shinto deities were often seen as manifestations of Buddhas.
But Buddhism had a massive structural problem for the new government, didn't it?
It did, because under the old Tokugawa shogunate, Buddhism was essentially a branch of the state administration.
Wait, really? How did that work?
Well, to root out hidden Christians over the previous centuries, the shogunate mandated that every single family in Japan had to register with a local Buddhist temple.
Oh, wow. So the Buddhist temples were essentially the local DMV and census bureau for the old military dictatorship.
That is exactly the right way to think about it. The temples held immense local power and were inextricably linked to the old regime. So the new government mandated something called Shinbutsu Bunri, which is the strict, forced separation of Shinto and Buddhism.
They needed a clean break.
Right. They needed to construct a new state Shinto. They elevated Shinto shrines, funded them with state money, and heavily promoted the theology that emphasized the divine ancestry of the imperial house. The emperor wasn't just a political ruler, he was the direct, living descendant of Amaterasu, the sun goddess.
Which is brilliant from a control standpoint. By elevating Shinto and making it the state religion, they were centralizing spiritual and political authority in one single body. If you disobey the government, you aren't just breaking the law. You are committing blasphemy against a living god.
Exactly.
But stripping power from the Buddhist temples couldn't have been a peaceful transition. People don't usually just let you tear down their local institutions.
It was not peaceful at all. The state sponsorship of Shinto unleashed a wave of localized violence known as Haibutsu Kishaku, which translates to abolish Buddhism and destroy Gautama Siddhartha. Emboldened by the government's anti-Buddhist stance, local officials and mobs literally attacked Buddhist institutions.
That's horrifying.
Thousands of temples were closed, destroyed, or had their lands seized. Priceless statues were melted down for bronze, and monks were forced to return to lay life or become Shinto priests.
It's a stark historical reality, isn't it? Sweeping political changes always have a visceral physical cost on the ground. And when you compound all of this, I mean, think about it. Your warlord just became a viscount. The local temple that registered your family for generations is being dismantled. Your class standing is abolished, and you're being told you must learn the ways of the terrifying foreigners. The psychological stress on the populace must have been just unbearable.
And that stress birthed something truly fascinating. The sources describe a bizarre cultural phenomena that erupted right in the middle of this transition period. It was called the Ija-Naika movement.
The Ija-Naika movement. Yeah. Which roughly translates to why not, or isn't it great, or even who cares?
Right. It has a very nihilistic but joyful undertone.
Our sources describe it as a spontaneous outbreak of ecstatic, almost hysterical behavior. People were taking to the streets, cross-dressing, throwing off their clothes, dancing wildly, chanting this phrase Ija-Naika, and essentially abandoning all social norms for days on end.
It was a massive, chaotic carnival that swept across various regions of Japan.
And if you put yourself in the shoes of a local merchant or farmer during this, it kind of makes sense. The reality you have known your entire life has collapsed. The rules have evaporated. Sometimes a mass ecstatic street riot is literally the only coping mechanism a society has left. It's like a collective nervous breakdown expressed through a neighborhood block party.
That's a very vivid way to describe it, but accurate. When the rigid structures that define reality dissolve, there is a period of intense societal vertigo. The Ija-Naika movement was the physical manifestation of a populace in profound flux. They were caught in the terrifying limbo between a dead era and an unborn one.
So they've bought out the warlords, they've centralized religion around the emperor, and the people are literally dancing in the streets to cope with the stress. They avoided immediate anarchy. But you can't run a modern global power on buyouts and street carnivals. You need an actual government.
Yes.
And you need an economy to pay for the massive debts you just took on.
Exactly. Now, they had to actually build the machine of a modern state. And almost immediately, because there's this vacuum of structural power, intense factions formed. They started fighting over what this new government should even look like.
And the sources outline three main camps here. First, you have a man named Itagaki Taisuke. He starts the freedom and people's rights movement. He and his followers are pushing hard for a constitutional monarchy and a true legislative assembly. In 1881, he helps found the Liberal Party, the Gyuto.
And this party leaned heavily toward French political doctrines, liberty, equality, and natural rights.
Okay, got it. Then the following year, another prominent leader, Okuma Shigenobu, established the Constitutional Progressive Party. He advocated for a British-style constitutional democracy, so a parliament with strong powers that could actually check the executive.
Right. But then, in response to both of these, the conservative government bureaucrats, the people actually holding the reins of power right then, they formed their own pro-government imperial rule party. These were the oligarchy, the elder statesmen known as the genro, and they were absolutely terrified of giving real power to the masses.
Which makes sense from their perspective. They just consolidated all this power. They don't want to hand it over to a voting public.
Exactly. The genro faced a very specific engineering problem. They needed to write a constitution that looked modern and civilized to the Western powers so they could renegotiate unequal treaties. But they wanted to keep the actual levers of power firmly in the hands of the emperor and his inner circle.
To solve this, a brilliant and pragmatic statesman named Ito Hirobumi literally went on a global shopping spree for a system of government. In 1882, he led a study mission to Europe to evaluate different constitutions.
Just think about the audacity of that. They didn't just let a constitution evolve naturally over centuries. They treated it like an engineering procurement process.
Yes, I picture it like they wanted to build a modern national operating system. They evaluate the United States Constitution, but Ito rejects it as too liberal. It gives too much power to the users, right?
Right, way too much democracy for their taste.
Then he looks at the British system, but decides it gives way too much control to the parliament and makes the monarchy too weak. He looks at the French and Spanish models and thinks they tend toward instability and despotism.
They were not ideological purists at all. They were searching for a very specific tool to do a very specific job. And Ito Hirobumi found his perfect operating system in Germany. He chose the Prussian constitutional model.
Why did Prussia appeal to them so much?
Because the Prussian system offered the facade of a modern constitutional democracy while hardwiring absolute control to the executive. It provided a framework for a modern state, sure, a parliament, a legal code, but ultimate sovereignty and authority remained firmly with the monarch. In Japan's case, the emperor was legally sacred and inviolable.
So they take this Prussian model, bring it back to Tokyo, draft it behind closed doors for years, and finally enact the Meiji Constitution in 1889. It creates the Imperial Diet, which has a House of Representatives and a House of Peers. On paper, to a Western observer, it looks like a modern parliament.
It looks great on paper.
But the mechanical reality on the ground was drastically different, wasn't it?
Oh, completely. The franchise, the right to vote for the House of Representatives, was brutally restricted. You had to be a male citizen over 25, and crucially, you had to pay at least 15 yen in direct national taxes.
15 yen doesn't sound like much today, but at the time, that restricted the vote to, what, approximately 1% of the entire population?
Roughly 1%, yes. Is a representative government exclusively for the absolute wealthiest landowners and elite. The emperor retained supreme legal authority, he commanded the armed forces directly, and the cabinet ministers were responsible solely to him, not to the elected legislature.
So they successfully modernized the architecture of their political structure without actually democratizing the power. It's really a masterclass in cynical statecraft.
Sure.
But building a government on paper is free. Building the physical infrastructure of a modern nation, railways, telegraphs, factories, a modern military that requires an unbelievable amount of capital and expertise. And just like they shopped for a constitution, they shopped for an industrial revolution.
They did. The economic transformation of the Meiji era was entirely state-led. In 1871, the government launched the Iwakura Mission. A massive delegation of the top Japanese leadership spent nearly 2 years touring the United States and Europe, meticulously studying Western industry, banking, education, and technology.
And they didn't just bring back blueprints, did they? They brought back human capital.
Exactly. This is one of the most fascinating logistical feats of the era. The government hired over 3,000 foreign experts. They called them Oyatoi Gaikokujin, or hired foreigners.
3,000.
Yeah, they brought in British engineers to build the first railways and telegraph lines. They hired French legal experts to draft criminal codes. American educators came to build the university system. German military strategists were brought in to train the army. It was a massive, unprecedented transfer of knowledge, directly fulfilling that Charter Oath's mandate to seek knowledge throughout the world.
But imagine the friction on the ground. I mean, you have a British engineer who speaks no Japanese trying to direct a crew of former samurai and peasant laborers to lay steel tracks for a steam engine they've never seen before, using translators who are desperately trying to invent new Japanese words for concepts like thermodynamics or liability.
The cultural friction was immense. And on top of that, these foreign experts were paid astronomical salaries. In some cases, a single foreign engineer was paid a higher monthly salary than a Japanese government minister.
Wow, that must have bred some resentment.
Of significant resentment. The Japanese government knew they couldn't rely on expensive, arrogant foreigners forever. So simultaneously, they sent thousands of brilliant young Japanese students overseas to study in Western universities, with the explicit goal of replacing the foreign experts as quickly as possible.
And this rapid knowledge transfer actually worked. I mean, they opened their first railway between Tokyo and Yokohama in 1872. They imported European textile machinery, and within a few decades, they were dominating the global silk and cotton yarn export markets.
And to accelerate this, the government heavily subsidized favored private enterprises. They would build a factory using state funds, get it running, and then sell it off at incredibly low prices to political allies and wealthy merchant families. This was the birth of the zaibatsu.
Ah, the zaibatsu. These are massive financial and industrial conglomerates. I always think of them like modern South Korean chaebols, or imagine if Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, and Lockheed Martin were all the same company and they were best friends with the federal government.
That's a terrifying but accurate comparison.
Right. Families like Mitsui and Mitsubishi built vast empires that controlled banking, shipping, mining, and manufacturing.
Hand in hand, the government and the zaibatsu built a ruthless mercantilist economy. They imported cheap raw materials, manufactured them into finished goods using newly acquired machinery and abundant cheap labor, and exported them for massive profits. The state provided the infrastructure and the protective policies, while the zaibatsu provided the industrial muscle.
Now, The narrative of the Meiji economic miracle is usually told from the perspective of those Zaibatsu executives or the government ministers. But we have to look at the reality for the average citizen, because paying for this miracle required squeezing the peasantry to an unprecedented degree. In 1873, the government passed the land tax reform.
This was the fundamental economic pivot of the era. Prior to this, taxes were paid by villages as a collective, and they were paid in rice based on the actual yield of the harvest.
But the new government needed a predictable, liquid budget to pay for their foreign experts, their railways, and their new army. So they legalized private land ownership, issued deeds, and assessed the land at a fixed monetary value. Then they demanded an annual tax of 3% of the land's value, payable exclusively in cash.
Put yourself in the position of a rural rice farmer. You have operated in a barter and crop-based economy your entire life. Suddenly, the tax collector doesn't want your rice. He wants cash.
And if the crop failed due to a drought, or if the national price of rice plummeted because of a bumper crop somewhere else, the farmer still owed the exact same fixed amount of cash to the government. This just sounds like a recipe for absolute disaster.
And it was a disaster for many. Countless peasant farmers couldn't generate the cash to pay the tax. They fell into crushing debt to predatory moneylenders and eventually had to forfeit their newly deeded ancestral land to wealthy absentee landlords.
So they went from being independent farmers to destitute tenant sharecroppers on their own land.
Yes.
So while Mitsubishi is getting rich building steamships, the rural farmers are losing everything to fund the tax base. You have deep, boiling resentment in the countryside, but an even more explosive resentment was building among a different class. The people who used to run the country. The former elite warriors who were rapidly realizing the government was systematically erasing their entire reason for existence.
Right, the samurai. While the political and economic changes were massive, the military changes struck at the very core of Japanese identity. For centuries, the samurai class held a total monopoly on military force. They were the only ones legally permitted to carry swords. It was the foundation of their prestige, their social standing, and their self-worth.
But the new Meiji leaders, and remember, many of them were former samurai themselves, they looked at the battlefields of Europe and the American Civil War. They realized that a small, elite warrior caste, no matter how skilled with the sword, could not stand up against a massive, conscripted national army equipped with repeating rifles and artillery.
So in 1873, the government enacted the conscription law. This mandated 3 years of compulsory active military service for all men upon turning 20, regardless of their social class.
The psychological devastation of this law just cannot be overstated. Imagine you're a samurai. For your entire life, your swords were your identity. Now, a government bureaucrat is telling you to hand them over, and they're putting a rifle in the hands of the peasant who used to bow to you in the dirt. It is the ultimate social equalizer, and it completely emasculated the samurai class.
And the wild part is, the peasants hated it just as much.
Mm-hmm.
The rural population was largely uneducated in modern statecraft. They didn't understand the concept of serving a nation. When the government used the term ketsueki to describe military service, it sparked absolute panic.
Ketsueki translates literally to blood tax, doesn't it?
Yes, blood tax. Because the peasants had no context for a modern draft, wild rumors spread that the government was literally going to extract their blood to sell to the foreigners or use it to dye the red blankets of the new military uniforms.
That is so morbid, and the fear was so intense that young men engaged in horrific self-mutilation to get out of it. They would literally chop off their own trigger fingers or maim their legs to fail the physical exams and avoid the draft. There were massive local uprisings against the conscription officers. Nobody wanted to be part of this new war machine.
But despite the intense domestic resistance, the government pushed forward ruthlessly. They modeled their new ground forces initially on the French military, adopting their rank structures and training methods, and later shifted to the highly efficient Prussian general staff system. They were forging a lethal, modern, European-style army in the heart of Asia.
It was really only a matter of time before the tension between this new conscript army and the obsolete, disenfranchised samurai class boiled over. And that brings us to 1877 and the Satsuma Rebellion. This is the ultimate tragic clash of two eras.
It really is a tragedy. The rebellion was led by Saigo Takamori, and the tragedy here is that Saigo was one of the founding fathers of the Meiji Restoration. He was a legendary hero who helped overthrow the shogun, but he became deeply disillusioned.
What changed for him?
He watched the rapid modernization, the rampant corruption of the Zaibatsu, and the stripping of samurai privileges, and he felt the soul of Japan was being destroyed.
So he resigns from the government in protest, returns to his home province of Satsuma in the Deep South, and establishes military academies. Thousands of disaffected, furious samurai flock to his banner. In February 1877, believing they are saving the emperor from his corrupt advisors, Saigo and an army of traditional samurai march north to challenge the central government.
This was the ultimate crucible for the new Meiji state. Could a newly minted army of peasant conscripts with rifles defeat the legendary, terrifying samurai in open, pitched battle?
The defining clash happens at the Battle of Taberuzaka. It is a brutal 8-day engagement. It's pouring rain, which turns the battlefield into deep mud and fouls the conscripts' rifles. Because their guns keep misfiring, it devolves into horrific hand-to-hand combat.
Just a nightmare scenario for a conscript.
Imagine the scene. Traditional samurai, fighting with unparalleled skill, wielding razor-sharp katanas, rushing the lines of terrified young farmers armed with bayonets.
The conscripts suffered horrific casualties, but they held their ground. And the decisive factor wasn't martial skill, it was modern logistics. The National Army, utilizing their new telegraph lines and steamships, could continuously funnel fresh troops, ammunition, and artillery to the front line. Saigo's samurai army, fighting a traditional campaign, just could not replace their losses.
It's a grinding war of attrition, and the samurai are slowly bleeding out. The rebellion is pushed back over months, culminating in a deeply cinematic tragedy at Mount Inade and finally in Kagoshima. Saigo and his forces are whittled down to nothing. They are outnumbered 7-1. Most surrender. But Saigo and his final 500 loyalists make one last desperate stand.
In September 1877, imperial forces close in. During the final assault, Saigo suffers a fatal bullet wound to the abdomen. True to the ancient warrior code, rather than be captured and humiliated by the government he helped create, he is honorably beheaded by his own trusted retainer on the battlefield.
Wow. And the remaining 40 samurai draw their swords and charge into the Gatling guns and artillery fire, dying to the last man. The rebellion is crushed. But the historical irony of this moment is staggering. Saigo was fighting to preserve the traditional warrior spirit against Western modernization. But the undeniable fact that a conscript army of farmers and merchants defeated the greatest samurai of the age, it proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the modernization was superior.
The conscript army's victory permanently validated the very system Saigo was trying to destroy. It proved the new military model worked, and with that, it forever closed the book on the samurai class. The warrior caste that had ruled Japan for centuries was officially violently dead.
The internal threat is neutralized. The Meiji government now possesses a unified country, a rapidly growing industrial base, and a battle-tested modern military. They survived the transition, so what do they do with all this new power?
They turn their gaze outward. With the home front secured, Japan steps onto the global stage.
Which marks a very complicated and heavy chapter for this deep dive. Foreign relations and the birth of Japanese imperialism.
To understand Japan's foreign policy during the latter half of the Meiji era, we really have to look at the intellectual shift happening among the elite. In 1885, a highly influential educator and public intellectual named Yukichi Fukuzawa published an essay called Leaving Asia.
Leaving Asia? That is a very blunt title.
It perfectly encapsulates the new mindset, though. Fukuzawa argued that Japan needed to culturally, politically, and militarily orient itself with the civilized nations of the West. He argued that to do this, Japan had to sever ties with its backward Asian neighbors, specifically Korea and King China, whom he viewed as hopelessly trapped in the past and destined to fall to Western powers.
The argument he is making is essentially, if we want to be treated as equals by the predatory Western empires, we have to act exactly like a predatory Western empire.
Yes. It exposes the brutal, undeniable logic of 19th century geopolitics. In the era of high imperialism, the world was divided into two categories: the colonizers and the colonized. To the Western powers, you were either sitting at the table carving up the map, or you were on the menu being carved up.
And Japan decided it absolutely refused to be on the menu. They believed that establishing a colonial empire of their own was the only mathematical way to guarantee national independence and force the West to rip up the unequal treaties they had signed decades earlier.
But the transition is fascinating to track, because early in the Meiji era, they took a very different approach. Look at the Maria Luz incident in 1817. A Peruvian ship, the Maria Luz, docks in Yokohama. It is carrying hundreds of exploited Chinese workers coolies who are being treated essentially as slaves.
And what did Japan do?
The Japanese government actually intervenes, boards the ship, frees the Chinese workers, and goes to an international tribunal to defend their actions. They won the case and earned the official thanks of the Qing imperial government.
So they act as a defender of Asian rights against Western exploitation. It's a noble early posture. But I struggle with the rapid pivot here because the historical record shows that just a couple of decades later, Japan is actively subjugating those same neighbors. They set their sights heavily on the Korean peninsula.
Well, geography dictates strategy. The Japanese leadership viewed the Korean peninsula as a dagger pointed at the heart of Japan. If a hostile Western power or a resurgent China controlled Korea, Japan's security was fundamentally compromised. Therefore, Japan felt it had to pull Korea out of China's traditional sphere of influence and bring it into its own.
This geopolitical tug-of-war escalates for years. There are pro-Japanese coups in Korea, assassination plots, and rising military tensions, and it finally boils over in 1894. A massive peasant uprising breaks out in Korea. The Korean king asks China for help. China sends troops but fails to properly notify Japan, which broke a prior treaty.
A technicality, but enough of a pretext.
Right. Japan uses this as a pretext to send a much larger military force. They seize the capital of Seoul, capture the Korean king, and install a pro-Japanese puppet government.
And when China attempts to reinforce its troops by sea, the modern Japanese Navy intercepts them and sinks a British steamer carrying Chinese soldiers. This act triggers the First Sino-Japanese War, lasting from 1894 to 1895.
And Japan doesn't just win, they win decisively. The modern, Prussian-trained Japanese army routs the larger but poorly modernized Qing forces. In the resulting peace treaty, Japan forces China to cede the island of Taiwan to them. Japan is now officially an imperial power with an overseas colony, but they don't stop with China.
No, they don't. A decade later, their expansionist ambitions clash directly with an actual European great power over dominance in Manchuria and Korea. This leads to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905.
Japan launches a surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, and what follows is a brutal, modern war featuring trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns, and the results stunned the entire globe. Japan, an Asian nation, defeated Imperial Russia.
It is hard to overstate the seismic shockwaves this sent around the world. For centuries, the doctrine of European white supremacy rested on the assumption of insurmountable military superiority. Japan shattered that myth permanently. They proved that a non-Western nation, through rapid industrialization and modernization, could meet a European empire on the battlefield and destroy its fleet.
The paradox of this moment is incredible. On one hand, Japan's victory over Russia became a beacon of hope for anti-colonial movements across the globe. Nationalists in India, intellectuals in the Middle East, and reformers in Vietnam looked at Japan and said, "It is possible to defeat the European empires. We can modernize and fight back."
But on the other hand...
Right. On the other hand, Japan was doing this specifically to build its own oppressive empire over its neighbors.
This imperial trajectory culminated in the final years of the Meiji era. Having removed Chinese and Russian influence from the peninsula, Japan formalized its total control with the annexation of Korea in 1910.
And our sources note clearly that this period of colonial rule over Korea, which lasted until the end of World War II in 1945, was characterized by forced assimilation and resource extraction. And it had lasting, deeply negative repercussions that persist in the geopolitical friction between Japan and both North and South Korea to this very day.
As we look at the sources, we observe the cold chain of cause and effect. The existential terror of Commodore Perry's black ships drove Japan to modernize at a breakneck pace. That modernization gave them the industrial capacity to project military power. And they utilized that power to emulate the very Western imperial model they feared, leading directly to the subjugation of their neighbors.
It's an incredibly heavy historical reality, from freeing exploited workers in 1872 to annexing an entire nation by 1910. The speed of the transformation is dizzying. But we've talked extensively about the macro-level changes, right? The military, the constitution, the wars, the taxes. How did this obsession with Westernization actually manifest in the daily lives, the culture, and the homes of the Japanese people?
That's where things get really fascinating. The cultural shift was, in many ways, much more visible and immediate than the political one. It was a kaleidoscope of ancient traditions violently colliding with Victorian trends.
Let's start with daily life and fashion. The elites are suddenly obsessed with projecting a civilized Victorian image, right?
Absolutely. Though wealthy merchants, politicians, and aristocratic families began building elaborate Western-style pavilions and reception rooms attached to their traditional Japanese homes. These were known as yokan or yoma.
Our sources mention popular women's magazines of the time, like Ladies Graphic. They would print full-page spreads of these elaborate, often completely empty Western rooms in the homes of the aristocracy, or even inside the imperial palaces. Having a Victorian parlor with heavy velvet curtains, imported carpets, and stiff wooden chairs became the ultimate status symbol.
It was performative civilization. But what's crucial to understand is that it wasn't a total replacement. It was a highly strategic fusion, integrating Western forms while desperately trying to preserve a native Japanese spirit, often summarized by the slogan, Japanese spirit, Western techniques, was the defining characteristic of Meiji society.
You see this fusion most clearly in the fashion, specifically what the sources call the kimono revolution.
Right, because you might assume that with all this Westernization, the kimono simply vanished, replaced by dresses and suits. But the reality is much more dynamic. The Japanese textile industry rapidly industrialized, and they began importing Western technologies, most notably cheap, chemical synthetic dyes.
This is a huge deal for fashion on the ground. Before this, bold, vibrant colors like deep purples and bright reds were incredibly labor-intensive and expensive to produce using natural plant dyes. That meant only the ultra-wealthy elite could afford to wear them. But suddenly, thanks to Western chemistry imports, anyone could afford a vibrant, boldly colored kimono.
And faster, mechanized weaving meant designers could experiment with bold, massive new patterns. It completely democratized high fashion for the emerging middle class.
Now, the emperor did issue a proclamation actively promoting Western dress in the public sphere, especially for officials. And men did start wearing wool Western suits and bowler hats to work in government offices and banks. But the sources note that the moment they went home, they took off the uncomfortable wool suits and put their kimonos back on.
The domestic sphere remained a sanctuary for tradition, though with new twists. For men, the trend became wearing highly decorative, intricate underkimonos, featuring scenes of battles or modern trains, which were then covered by a very plain, subdued outer kimono. It was a hidden luxury.
Oh, that's really cool. And for women?
For women, the underkimonos became radically colorful, mixing completely different fabrics and clashing designs in ways that would have been scandalous in the Edo period. They even invented an entirely new style of dress called the hamangi, or visiting dress, which bridged the gap between highly formal ceremonial wear and everyday dress.
But the most abrupt, disorienting disruption to daily life wasn't what people wore, it was how they tracked reality itself.
Ah, yes.
This detail from the sources completely blew my mind. In 1873, the government abruptly decided to sync Japan with the West by switching from the traditional lunisolar calendar to the Western Gregorian calendar.
It is hard to fathom the logistical chaos this caused.
I mean, let's play it out. Imagine you are a merchant in a bustling Tokyo market. You have banking contracts, harvest schedules, religious festivals, and loan interest, all calculated based on the traditional lunar months. You go to sleep in what you think is the 12th month of the 5th year of Meiji, expecting the new year in a few weeks. And you wake up and the government simply deletes almost a month from the year. They say, surprise, today is January 1st, 1873. We are on Western time now. All your contracts are instantly a mess. The whiplash is incredible.
It sounds crazy, but it was a necessary chaos. If Japan was going to trade seamlessly with London, conduct diplomacy with Washington, and operate on the global stage, they could not be weeks out of sync with the powers they were trying to emulate. They had to adopt the temporal operating system of the West.
And this intense interaction with the West completely transformed the Japanese art world, too. Western art techniques were flooding into the country, specifically oil painting and the European tradition of the nude figure. And this led to a massive culture clash with the Kurosaki scandal of 1895.
Kurosaki was a highly prominent Japanese painter who had spent nearly a decade studying in France. He absorbed the French Impressionist and academic styles. Upon returning to Japan, he exhibited a painting called Morning Toilette at the 4th National Industrial Exhibition. It depicted a highly realistic, fully nude woman standing before a mirror.
And the Japanese public completely lost their minds over it. It caused a massive scandal. In traditional Japanese art, nudity was largely confined to erotic shunga woodblock prints, not high culture exhibitions. It's a perfect example of the friction between importing civilized Western artistic standards and local moral sensibilities.
But while Western art was shocking Japan domestically, Japanese art was absolutely captivating the West.
The Meiji government was incredibly shrewd about this. They realized very early on that while their heavy industry was decades behind, their traditional Japanese art and craftsmanship were highly valued in Europe and America.
They recognized art as a vital, high-margin export commodity. It could generate the foreign currency needed to buy warships and train engines.
They took this so seriously. They treated art like a strategic national resource. They created a semi-public company called the Kiritsu Kosho Kaisha specifically to commercialize, standardize, and promote art exports. They funded massive, meticulously curated displays at world's fairs, like the 1873 Vienna exhibition and the 1876 Centennial exhibition in Philadelphia. In Philadelphia alone, they sent over 30,000 individual items to display.
And this strategic, state-sponsored export of culture sparked a massive, sweeping craze across Europe and America known as Japonism. Western artists, from impressionists like Monet and Van Gogh to interior designers and architects, became utterly obsessed with Japanese aesthetics, asymmetry, and color palettes.
But the cruel irony is that back in Japan, because cheap Western imports and modern styles were so popular domestically, the local demand for traditional Japanese art actually collapsed.
Which meant the traditional artists had to innovate rapidly and pivot entirely to the export market just to survive. And our sources emphasize that they reached unprecedented technological peaks in the decorative arts during this time, precisely because they were competing for wealthy Western buyers.
They took ancient techniques and pushed them to their absolute limits. Let's look at cloison enamel. Artists like Namikawa Yasuyuki elevated the medium. Traditionally, cloison uses metal wires to separate different colored enamels. Yasuyuki developed techniques to use fewer enclosing metal strips, allowing for vast, subtle areas of blank space and incredibly detailed pictorial designs that look like delicate paintings rather than metalwork.
Or consider lacquerware.
Yeah.
Shibata Zishin, widely considered Japan's greatest lacquer artist, realized that Western buyers preferred hanging oil paintings on walls rather than using traditional Japanese lacquer boxes. So he adapted. He started creating highly original textured lacquer panels and putting them in ornate Western-style picture frames to imitate the format of oil paintings. It was brilliant aesthetic marketing.
Then there's metalwork. Remember how the government violently separated Shinto and Buddhism? Well, craftsmen who used to cast massive bronze temple bells and Buddhist statues were suddenly out of work.
Right, no temples to buy them.
Exactly. So artists like Suzuki Chokichi pivoted. He started creating hyper-realistic, exaggerated bronze sculptures of animals, like his famous 12 hawks. These were massive, intricate centerpieces specifically designed to awe foreign judges and wealthy industrialists at international exhibitions.
But the most perfect microcosm of this entire era, the adaptation, the cultural shift, and the survival instinct, is the story of the ivory carvers.
The Netsuke makers. This is my absolute favorite logistical detail from the sources.
It's a great story.
For centuries, Japanese men wore traditional kimonos, and kimonos do not have pockets. So if a man wanted to carry tobacco or coins or a seal, he kept them in a small pouch hung from his silk sash. To keep the pouch from slipping through the sash, they used small, intricately carved toggles called netsuke.
And carving these netsuke was a highly respected, deeply intricate artisan industry for generations.
But then the Meiji era happens. The government pushes westernization. Men start wearing wool suits to work. And what do Western suits have? Pockets.
Pockets, a simple textile feature that literally destroyed a centuries-old artisan industry overnight.
Because men had pockets, they didn't need pouches. Because they didn't need pouches, they didn't need netsuke. The domestic market vanished. So to survive the fashion trend, these master ivory carvers had to invent a completely new art form.
They pivoted entirely.
Right. They pivoted from carving tiny functional belt toggles to carving elaborate large-scale ivory sculptures, eagles, farmers, mythological scenes. These were designed purely as interior decoration for Victorian parlors in the West and for the modernized imperial family. An entire industry was saved by pivoting from belt toggles to parlor statues.
It really is the Meiji era in a nutshell.
Yeah.
They were forced to adapt by overwhelming Western influence, but they utilized immense traditional Japanese skill to create something entirely new in order to survive and thrive.
And this same synthesis, this deliberate engineering of culture, happened in music, too. Western music didn't just drift in on the wind. It was actively strategically imported through three main channels: the military, Christian missions, and the public education system.
Right. The new conscript military realized they needed Western-style martial music to march to and to signal troops. So they formed military bands known as kotokitai, initially using just woodwinds and drums. They hired French and German conductors to teach these former samurai and peasants how to read sheet music and play Wagner and Tchaikovsky.
That must have sounded so foreign to them at first.
Oh, totally alien. But these bands became immensely popular, performing at public venues like the famous Rokumeikan Hall in Tokyo, where the elite gathered to practice ballroom dancing.
Meanwhile, the centuries-old ban on Christianity was finally lifted. Orthodox and Catholic missionaries flooded into the port cities, bringing with them traditional choral and hymnal music. You had figures like the Orthodox choir conductor Ike of Tihai training the very first generation of Japanese Christian musicians in complex four-part harmonies.
But the most profound impact came when the state took centralized control of musical education. The government realized that to build a unified modern citizenry, they needed to teach children a unified musical culture. Figures like Isawa Shuji worked directly with American educators like Luther Whiting Mason to found the Tokyo Academy of Music in 1887.
And they didn't just teach Western music, did they? They engineered a hybrid.
Yes, they literally wrote the first standardized music score collections for primary schools. They took traditional Japanese melodies and scales and harmonized them using Western musical theory, creating deliberate, state-sponsored songs for children to sing. They engineered a new national soundscape from the ground up.
From the Constitution to the Army, from the tax code to the art on the walls and the songs in the schools, it is just breathtaking how thorough and calculated this national transformation was.
It really is.
When we look back at the immense journey we just took today, from the terrifying, smoky arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1854 to a nation that, by 1912, was producing world-class industrial exports, dominating European empires on the battlefield and exporting cutting-edge art to the world. How do we even begin to summarize this?
The Meiji era is, without question, a historical masterclass in adaptation. The Japanese leadership faced the most severe existential threat imaginable, which was the reality of being conquered, carved up, and colonized by technologically superior foreign empires.
They could have easily become another King China.
Exactly, but they didn't retreat into denial. They didn't rely on ancient traditions to save them. They systematically and often ruthlessly dismantled their own ancient society. They absorbed Western technology, military tactics, political structures, and art, and they synthesized all of it with their own national identity. By doing so, they safeguarded their independence and transformed themselves into a global titan.
And to you, listening right now, why does this matter to you? Beyond being just a fascinating historical story of samurai and steam trains, it matters because the Meiji era is the ultimate case study in managing overwhelming disruptive change.
We all face moments, either personally or societally, where the rules of our reality shift unexpectedly.
Right. And when faced with a world-ending disruption, Japan didn't hide. They studied the threat, they adapted to it, they tore down their own obsolete systems, and they mastered the new paradigm on their own terms. It's a profound lesson in ruthless pragmatism, resilience, and the willingness to let go of the past to secure a future.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought to consider based on everything we've explored.
If the Meiji Restoration was triggered by the sudden, undeniable, physical arrival of new technology and immense foreign pressure in 1854, what are the Commodore Perry's black ships of our current era?
It's a vital question to ask ourselves. What global technological leap or what massive, undeniable social or environmental force today might be so powerful that it could force a modern nation to completely reinvent its entire society, its economy, its government, and its culture in just a single generation?
Are we looking at the horizon right now, waiting for the smoke to appear, or are the ships already in the harbor? Think back to our opening metaphor. Historical change isn't a clean break on an X-ray. The Meiji era wasn't setting a broken bone, it was completely replacing the entire skeleton of a nation while the patient was running a marathon, and somehow they won the race. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we will see you next time.